All right, so for my ethics discussion pertaining to euthanasia, I chose the case about Robert Latimer. So just to give you guys a little bit of background information, Robert Latimer was a Saskatoon farmer who in 1993 murdered his severely disabled and chronically painful 12-year-old daughter, Tracy, who had cerebral palsy. Tracy was claimed to have the mental capabilities of a 4-month-old baby and was a quadriplegic who required assistance for feeding, for any ambulation or moving around. And she had already also undergone many painful surgeries and was on track to receive more for the rest of her life. So, what is the main argument for euthanasia in this scenario? So, the main argument in this scenario, I think, is whether or not Robert was correct in murdering his daughter given the circumstances of her condition. So, Tracy, when she was born, she was deprived of oxygen at birth, and it led to the severe cerebral palsy that she dealt with. So, she would suffer 5 to 6 seizures each day, despite being on medication to control them. And this medication also made it so she wasn't able to take any pain medication aside from acetaminophen, also known as Tylenol. So Tracy had undergone multiple surgeries already up until this point, one of which was having metal rods placed in her spine in an attempt to correct scoliosis. And this surgery alone took a year to recover from. The next surgery that she was on track for by Tracy's doctors was scheduled for a month after she was killed. So I believe she was murdered in October of 1993. This surgery was set to take place in November of 1993. And the point of this surgery was to resolve pain that she was feeling from her hip that would dislocate. So it would involve removing the upper portion of her femur and allowing the lower part of her leg to be attached just by connective tissue. And this surgery also would have been a 1 year estimated recovery. And then she would also need further surgeries in the future to relieve pain from other various joints in her body. And this is where it got to the point where Robert and his wife began thinking, you know, she is in pain and this will never end. The rest of her life will entail of surgeries to manage the pain. The surgeries are painful, and they started viewing these procedures as mutilation. So I mean, I'm sure if a program exists that allowed Tracy to be able to pass in a controlled healthcare setting, I'm certain the Latimer family would have looked into it to end their daughter's pain, and what they believe to be, kind of endless suffering for her. So the argument kind of circles back to, and the main point is whether Robert was justified and if he was acting morally and ethically correct by ending his daughter's life. So the second question is, do you agree with this agreement of euthanasia in this case? Why or why not? So I am having a really hard time deciding how I feel about this case. Relating it back to course content, we've learned about autonomy, which Tracy, she didn't have. She didn't have the mental capacity or competency to partake in her own health or have opinions, so her parents took this on. I mean, even as a minor, unless she was declared a mature minor, people at the age of 12 wouldn't have necessarily a say in their own healthcare setting. Like their parents would have the last decision, but where she was nonverbal and had the mental capacity of a 4-month-old baby, she couldn't even tell her parents, hey, I am, in extreme pain. She wasn't able to voice any opinions or feelings or anything like that to her parents, so her parents completely took that role on. Um, so something that I thought to myself was, what choice did Robert and his wife have in this situation? So autonomy is all about getting information and then being able to make informed decisions based on that information. So, I mean, their daughter, she had a severe disability that she was born with, and that for 12 years was being managed through, different surgeries, medications. Um, and the surgeries that she had in the past were all painful, and there was no end to those painful and long recoveries in sight. So, the doctors informed Robert and his wife the next step for her, which I mentioned prior, was to resolve that hip that kept dislocating when she seized. So, once again, she would have 5 to 6 seizures a day. Each time she seized, her hip would pop in and out of place. So the next step would be repairing that. It would take a year to recover from, and it involves her leg hanging on by nothing but connective tissue. So what if Robert and his wife decided to not go forward with this surgery, that to them seemed like mutilation? So do they continue to living with their daughter, who they know is in excruciating pain every time her hip dislocates, and they listen to her scream in agony, or do they opt in for the surgery, which personally they believe is mutilation and will cause more pain. So in 1993, there was no mercy killing or doctor assisted suicide or another option that involved their daughter not being in pain, leaving Robert and his wife debating I mean, it was Robert that was the one who followed through with the unthinkable option of killing his daughter. And he claimed he did it in the most humane way that he could think of. So he hooked up a tube from the exhaust pipe of his truck, and he brought the tube and put the other end of it into the cab of his truck, and he placed Tracy inside, where she died of carbon monoxide poisoning, which essentially would have just felt like she fell asleep and never regained consciousness. So I mean, Robert and his wife, they thought, Tracy's condition is never going to get better. Um, we do definitely have more options now in 2021 for accessibility and treatments and things like that than what they may have had in 1980 when Tracy was born and during her childhood. But at the time, Robert claims that he didn't feel like he had another choice. She would never be free of pain or able to function in a productive manner. And even now, in Canada, it's legal to withdraw life support or decide not to put it in place at all. So comparing a situation of someone who will never regain functioning or quality of life, getting withdrawn from life support, and Robert deciding to humanely and peacefully put his daughter to rest, who he knew would never be without pain or able to function. I agree that Robert thinks he was acting in a way that he felt was truly looking out for the best interest of his daughter, which also would kind of fall into the principle of beneficence. And he didn't want to cause her any more harm, which would be the non-maleficence. I mean, he was informed about the future for his daughter and what it looked like, and he made the only decision that he felt would give his daughter peace. So he definitely thinks he did the right thing. Personally, I'm still undecided about the matter. I think that he thinks he did the right thing, and that's what he lives with, and that's what he is okay with. But as someone who isn't a parent and who likely will never be in that same situation, it is so hard to decide whether I think that he was acting morally or ethically, because it's impossible to put myself in his shoes to understand his actions. Um, do I think what he did was necessarily right, or do I agree with it? I don't think so, but do I understand where he thinks, like, where he was coming from and why he thinks that he was correct in doing so? Yes, I do. I do see that side of it. So, what ethical dilemma may arise with this specific case of euthanasia is question 3. So, I've already touched on this in the previous question, but I believe the ethical dilemma is that although, yes, Robert Latimer committed a murder, was it ethical since in his mind he was putting his daughter out of her misery? He believed that this was the ethical choice. So, this could be an example, perhaps demonstrating that something that may be ethical isn't legal. And I know this isn't a healthcare setting, but I am still going to discuss the ethical principles of healthcare um, to this, since this topic seems relevant. And with her health condition, I am certain that, if euthanasia existed in the 90s, this is something that they would have been fighting for Tracy. Um, I mean, Tracy, she was incapacitated, not of competent mind to practice autonomy. So her parents, like I said prior, took this role for her. As I mentioned in my previous response as well, regarding to whether or not I agree with this situation, the principle of beneficence shines really well here too. So this concerns what is in the best interest of the person, and Robert didn't believe that it was in Tracy's best interest to continue being in the pain that she was, and he didn't believe it was within her best interest to get more surgeries that would just be causing more pain. It would alleviate the pain that she was feeling from her hip dislocating, but then she would have the pain from that, extensive surgical procedure. And it still wouldn't allow her to walk. It wouldn't allow her to be any more mobile. So in his mind, he was doing what was in the best interest of his daughter. And then non-maleficence, so not doing harm, putting Tracy through another painful surgery to reduce her hip pain, that would cause pain and require a year to recover from, when, like I said before, it's not going to improve her mobility or quality of life necessarily. Seem to be doing more harm than it would do good. These are key things that drove Robert to take the life of his daughter. Um, it doesn't seem from the research that I've done independently, as well as interviews that I've watched with Robert, it doesn't seem that this was an act of aggression or dislike of his daughter. It was quite the opposite. He loved her so much, and he felt that um, as her father, he owed it to her and should be the one to finally give her peace, because to him, he didn't seem as though alive she would ever be able to experience that. So the fourth question is, what changes would you make to the existing laws regarding euthanasia or medical assistance in dying? So at least one change. So if euthanasia or medical assisted dying was an option in 1993 for Robert and his family, I'm sure this is something that they would have researched and looked into for Tracy, because they in their opinion and from what they heard from informed doctors, they felt as though their daughter's life was just being prolonged. The surgeries were bandage fixes; they were causing her more pain, and not a whole lot of benefit. I mean, 30 years has passed since Tracy passed away. But the criteria for medical assistance in dying is very strict still 30 years later. It's only been an option since 2016. And it does definitely make sense that the criteria is very strict, but several of the criteria listed to be eligible for medical assistance in dying would not have even been met by Tracy. So since she was 12 years old, severely disabled, and had the mentality of a 4-month-old baby, thus definitely not meeting the criteria of, and I have quoted here directly from the Government of Canada website, one of the criteria is being 18 years of age and mentally competent, be able to make health decisions for self. Tracy was neither of those things, and although it's impossible to know if she would have made it to the age of 18, even if she did, she completely lacked the mental competency and still would not have been eligible, as she would not have been able to make the choice for herself. One thing about this legislation that I think should or could be changed, that would have at least allowed the Latimer family to perhaps be able to utilize this and have a more peaceful way of their daughter passing on, would be to have the allowance of a designated family member be able to make these decisions for those who are unable to do so. So, as of right now, like I just mentioned a moment ago, in order to be eligible for doctor assisted suicide or euthanasia in Canada, one of the criteria is being above the age of 18 and be able to make health decisions for yourself. So it doesn't say anything about, having a proxy or having anyone designated to make those decisions for you. You need to be competent to make the decision yourself. So anybody who is severely disabled or anything like that would not have the capacity to make those choices. Um, so to have someone like a designated family member who could make those decisions would have potentially made a difference in this situation, and perhaps others as well. So similar, to how in a healthcare setting, if someone is on a support, like life support or a feeding tube, a designated family member can choose to withdraw care, which would lead to death. Because in Canada, it is legal to remove life support or a feeding tube. A designated family member would be the one to make would be the one to be informed and be the one to make the decision pertaining to that. And although much more fine print and criteria would need to be added to that, I think anyone who is in debilitating pain or is terminally ill or experiencing a multitude of issues causing them suffering, if it is just, be able to end their life peacefully and not need to suffer it out until it happens naturally. For Tracy, like I said, she never would have been eligible for this program as it stands now. However, that doesn't negate the excruciating pain that she was claimed to be in and the suffering that her family is certain that she endured. The fact that there is no end to any of that in sight was something that led Robert to his choice to murder his daughter. Supportive measures can only do so much for people who are severely disabled, and like I said, we have more things now than what they would have had in 1993. Not to speak for others, but as Robert Latimer said in an interview, he wouldn't want to live in pain like that, nor would most Canadians. And many Canadians supported him in the decision he made back in 1993 because it was all over the media. To this day, he stands by his decision and has created a precedent that has no doubt contributed to the availability of medical assistance in dying today in Canada.